The call came in at 11:40 at night, a low-pressure complaint on a residential loop in Reservoir Hill. Nothing dramatic. An old lady on Callow Avenue said her stove was burning weak, blue flame going lazy, and dispatch flagged it to me because I was already the closest van in the northwest quadrant of the city. I'd been doing gas network maintenance out of the Baltimore office for 8 years by then, nights mostly. You get used to reading a system the way other people read weather. Pressure drops on a residential loop usually mean one of three things: a regulator drifting out of spec, a corroded main starting to weep, or somebody drawing more off the line than they're supposed to. The first two are boring. The third one is almost always a contractor who tapped a line for a garage heater and forgot to file anything. That's how I went into the night. Assuming the boring version, I pulled up on Callow around midnight. The whole block was quiet in that specific Baltimore way. Row houses shoulder to shoulder, half of them dark, a few with the blue TV glow leaking through curtains. November cold, the kind that dries your lips out on the walk from the van to the door. Trash bags stacked at the curb because pickup was Tuesday. I remember a cat sitting on top of one, watching me the whole time I got my gear out. The old lady's name was Miss Doris. She met me at the door in a housecoat and slippers, and she told me twice she'd been a customer for 40 years. I checked her service line, her meter, her regulator. Everything on her side was clean, but the pressure at her stove was low. She wasn't imagining it. I told her I'd check the main and be back. The way you find a draw on a residential loop is boring detective work. You walk it, you pull the covers on the curbside test points, and you take readings, house by house, working outward from the complaint until the numbers stop making sense. I had my gauge, my logbook, and a headlamp. The wind was pushing dead leaves along the gutter, and every so often, a dog would start up 2 streets over and then quit as suddenly as it had begun. Fourth test point, 3 houses down from Miss Doris. I got a reading I didn't like. Not catastrophic, just wrong. The pressure was sitting about 18% below what it should be for that segment at that hour. And when I checked the next point after it, the pressure came back up almost to normal. That means the draw is between those 2 points, 120 feet of pipe under the sidewalk, which means somebody, somewhere in those 3 houses, was pulling harder than their meter was showing. I flagged the segment on my tablet and went back to the middle house on foot to look at it properly. It was a row house like the others. Brick front, 3 concrete steps up, black railing that had been repainted about 15 times. The porch light was off. No car out front. The front curtains were drawn, and you could see there wasn't any light behind them either. From outside, it looked like nobody had lived there in a while. The meter was on the side, in the little alley between that house and its neighbor. I walked around with the headlamp on low. That's when I saw it. The service line came off the main and went to the meter, normal, everything as it should be at the front. But underneath the meter, before the line went into the house, there was a second fitting, a T. Clean brass, not weathered, sitting on a short vertical run that dropped down and disappeared into a hole in the foundation. The hole had been cored, not chipped. The concrete edges were smooth. Somebody had used a proper coring bit, the kind that costs more than a used car. I stood there for a while just looking at it. You have to understand, a homeowner who steals gas usually does it badly. They cut into the line upstream of the meter with whatever they have on hand. Compression fitting from a hardware store, hose clamps, sometimes literal duct tape on the couplings. You see it a couple of times a year, and it's always sad and always dangerous. This wasn't that. This was done by somebody who knew what they were doing. There was a shutoff valve on the bypass. There was an isolation flange. The pipe going into the foundation was black iron, correct schedule, threaded properly, pipe dope on every joint. Whoever installed this had done it the way I would have done it if I'd been the one stealing. I put my gloved hand on the pipe going into the wall. It was warm, not hot, just warm, the way a working gas line feels when there's real flow through it. I stepped back into the alley and looked up at the side of the house. 2 small basement windows at ground level, both bricked in, new brick, cleaner than the rest of the wall, mortar still light-colored. It hadn't been done that long ago. Years, maybe, but not decades. The rest of the house looked like it hadn't been touched since the 80s. I went back around to the front and stood on the sidewalk and just looked at the place. No mail piled up on the porch, which meant someone was collecting it, but no lights inside, no sound coming out, and a bypass in the alley pulling enough gas to drop pressure on the whole loop. I called my supervisor from the van. His name was Ray, and he'd been on nights longer than I had. I told him what I'd found. The T, the coring, the bricked windows. I heard him breathing on the other end for a couple of seconds. "You touch anything?" he said. "Just the pipe, to see if it was flowing." "Is it flowing?" "Yeah, warm to the touch." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Shut the bypass. Don't open the meter. Don't ring the door. Get back in the van and lock it and call the county." I asked if he wanted me to wait for someone before I closed it. He said no. He said shut it and sit in the van. I went back around to the alley. The shutoff on the bypass was a standard quarter-turn ball valve, right where a competent installer would have put it. I closed it. I heard the flow stop through the pipe, that little settling noise you get when a live line goes dead. I remember standing there for a second with my hand still on the valve, listening for anything from inside the wall. There wasn't anything. No shout, no footsteps, just the house, being a house. I walked back to the van, locked the doors, and called dispatch. I told them I needed county police and the fire marshal at that address, and that I was staying on scene but not approaching. Dispatch asked me twice if I was in danger. I told them I didn't know. The first cruiser got there in about 9 minutes, then another one, then a fire engine. No sirens. They'd been told to come in quiet. A guy in a plain windbreaker with a badge on a lanyard came over and had me walk him through what I'd seen from the pressure reading forward. He wrote in a little notebook while I talked. Then he thanked me and told me to stay in the van and keep the engine running. They didn't kick the door. They knocked. Nobody answered. They knocked again. Then one of the uniforms went around to the alley with a flashlight, and I watched him look at the bypass and the bricked windows the same way I had, standing there for a long time without moving. I don't know exactly what they did to get inside. I was facing the wrong way for it. But at some point the front door was open, and there were people going in with hard cases and respirators, and one of them came back out fast and threw up in the tree well by the curb. I sat in the van for maybe another hour before anyone came to talk to me again. When somebody did, it was the guy in the windbreaker. He asked if I'd seen anyone go in or out of the house in the last 2 hours. I told him no. He nodded like that matched something. He said they'd picked the owner up about 6 blocks north, walking with a duffel bag, and that the guy had a set of house keys in his pocket and hadn't said a word since they cuffed him. He didn't tell me what was in the basement, not that night. I got most of it later, some from Ray, some from the paper. There was a full production setup down there, not a hobby. Industrial is what one of the fire investigators called it when I ran into him at a training a few months later. The gas was being used 2 ways. Part of it fed burners for the process. Part of it was actual feedstock, going into the reaction itself. That's why the draw was as steady as it was, day and night, for years. The bricked windows were for containment, and to keep anyone on the sidewalk from seeing what the walls looked like on the inside. The tap in the alley had been in the ground more than 2 years. That was the number they settled on, from the corrosion pattern on the T, and utility records showing the loop had been running a hair low on that segment since the summer of 2019. Nobody had chased it, because a hair low isn't a work order, it's a rounding error. The house got condemned inside of a week. They put the yellow paper on the door and fenced the front yard off. Miss Doris told me later she used to wave at the man who lived there in the mornings when he'd come out for the paper. She said he always waved back. I still work nights. I still read pressure the way other people read weather. But I check the alleys now, on every call, whether the numbers tell me to or not. There's a guy who used to come into the plant every 10 days. Same bag, same clothes, same stains. I worked the night intake at a commercial laundry in southeast Baltimore for a little over 3 years, and out of everyone who walked through that door, he's the one I'm still not done thinking about. We mostly did restaurant linens and a couple of hotel contracts out toward BWI, big canvas carts, mesh bags with barcodes, the whole thing on wheels. Private drop-offs were rare because we weren't cheap and we weren't fast, but the front counter took walk-ins from about 6 to 10 on weekdays if you called ahead. That's when I'd see him. First time was late 2017. He came in maybe 20 minutes before close carrying one of those blue IKEA bags folded down on itself so it looked half empty. Older guy, maybe 50s, khakis, and a plain windbreaker, glasses that didn't fit his face very well. Polite, said, "Good evening," like people from the county still do, paid in cash, always exact. He gave me 1 pair of Carhartt work pants, 1 long-sleeved denim shirt, 1 white cotton undershirt, 1 pair of white cotton socks. 1 canvas apron, the kind you'd see on a butcher or a woodworker, with 2 front pockets and a neck loop. That was it. Every time. For almost 3 years. The stains were in the same places too. That's the part that took me a while to notice, because when you handle 30 pounds of soiled linen an hour, you stop looking at individual pieces. Bibs, aprons, chef coats, they all blur. But he was a private ticket, so I had to tag his items one by one on the intake sheet and mark pre-existing damage. After maybe the 5th or 6th visit, I started noticing that the apron had the same brown crust on the lower right, in a spread pattern like someone had wiped a hand across it. The Carhartts had it on the thighs, small drips, and inside the right cuff. The denim shirt on both forearms, ending at the elbow, like he'd been leaning over something. The undershirt only ever had a smear on the belly. The socks, tiny spots on the toes, every 10 days. Sometimes 11, sometimes 9 if a weekend got in the way, but if you averaged it out, 10. I didn't think about it much the first year. People are weird, jobs are weird. Baltimore is full of guys with strange routines. I figured he worked construction or ran a small butcher setup out of his garage. I've seen worse. We used to get a guy from a crab house on Boston Street who'd drop off aprons that smelled so bad you had to run them twice. What started to bother me was the sameness. The clothes themselves, sure, but also the way they never seem to age. If you wear Carhartts every 10 days for 2 years, they should start to fade. They should get patched. His didn't. They looked identical every drop-off. Same for the shirt. The apron never developed the buildup you get on canvas over time. I remember thinking at some point that either he owned multiple identical sets and rotated them, or the clothes weren't old at all. I mentioned it to my shift manager once. He was a big Filipino guy we called Ver, and he'd been at the plant longer than anyone. He shrugged and said, "Some people got a uniform. Leave it alone." So I left it alone. Late spring of 2020, we were running skeleton crews because of the pandemic. The hotels dropped off almost entirely. Restaurants too. It was mostly me and one press operator most nights, and the front counter lights stayed off because we weren't taking walk-ins. But this guy kept coming. Ver had put him on a special list because he'd been a regular for years. He'd knock at the side door by the loading bay, I'd let him in, weigh his bag, tag it, and send him off. 10 minutes tops. That June, I finally did something about it. I'd been talking on and off with a girl I went to Dundalk High with. She'd gone into forensic chem and was working out of a lab attached to one of the hospitals. Casual thing, we texted about dumb stuff. One night, I told her, half joking, that I had a customer whose stains looked like blood and could you actually tell from dry laundry. She said sure, if the fabric hadn't been washed yet and if I could get her a sample, she'd run it as a favor. Not officially, just a spot test. Next time he came in, I did something I shouldn't have. When I was tagging the apron, I took a small pair of scissors we used for thread and clipped a square from the inside hem, where the fabric folds under. Maybe a half inch. He wouldn't notice. No one would. I put it in a Ziploc and dropped it off at her lab the next afternoon. She called me 4 days later. She said, "Where'd you get this?" I told her. "Customer at the plant." She was quiet for a second. Then she said the stain was human blood, and it was consistent with the 2 previous samples I'd sent her. I hadn't sent her 2 previous samples. I told her that. She said, "You didn't drop off 2 little baggies before this?" I said no. She said okay. She'd double check her intake log and get back to me. She never brought it up again, and I didn't push. She was doing me a favor off the books, and I got the sense she wanted the whole thing to go away. But that part sat with me. Somewhere in her lab, there were 2 other little squares of fabric with the same blood on them, and I hadn't put them there. I started paying more attention to him after that. Not obviously, just watching how he moved, what he said, whether he ever looked around. He didn't. He'd hand me the bag, wait while I weighed and tagged, take his ticket, and leave. He didn't small talk. He didn't ever ask about pickup, he just knew the turnaround. The one thing I did notice was that he never took his hands out of his jacket pockets while he waited. Not in 3 years. Even in July, in a building where the presses put the room temperature over 90, hands in his pockets. The last time he came in was the second week of August 2020. It had rained hard that afternoon, and the loading bay smelled like wet asphalt and bleach. He was 10 minutes early. He set the blue bag on the counter, and I unzipped it and started pulling items out to tag. Same pants, same shirt, same undershirt, same socks, same apron. The apron had a fresh smear on the front pocket that I hadn't seen before. Long, curved, dark red, where it hadn't dried all the way. It had wet the pocket lining. I could feel it through my glove. I remember looking up at him. He was watching the intake sheet, not me. The overhead light was catching his glasses, so I couldn't see his eyes. He said, "Everything okay?" I said, "We're actually pretty backed up right now. I'm not sure I can turn this around in the usual window." He looked at me then. Just looked. His face didn't change. He said, "How long?" I said I didn't know, but we were prioritizing the hotel contracts, and I couldn't promise anything under 3 weeks. I told him he might want to try somewhere else this time. He stood there for what felt like a while, but was probably 4 seconds. Then he zipped the bag back up, said, "All right, thank you," and walked out the side door. I sat down on the intake stool after he left, and I sat there for maybe 10 minutes without doing anything. I told Ver the next night that I'd turned him away. Ver looked at me for a second and then just nodded and said, "Okay." He didn't ask why. I think he knew I wouldn't have done it without a reason, and I think he didn't want the reason. I stopped waiting for the knock every 10 days. For the first month, I kept glancing at the side door around 9. After that, I stopped. Late September, I was picking up a sandwich at a place off Eastern Avenue, 2 blocks from the plant. There's a small laundromat on the corner across from it, one of those neighborhood setups with the coin machines up front and a wash and fold counter in the back. I was standing at the deli window waiting for my order, and I saw him come out of the laundromat carrying a blue IKEA bag folded down on itself. He didn't see me. He walked to a gray sedan parked halfway down the block, put the bag in the trunk, and drove off toward the water. I stood at that window until the guy behind the counter called my number twice. The laundromat across the street is still there. I drove past it a few weeks later on a Sunday, and there was a girl at the wash and fold counter, maybe 20, reading something on her phone. Small place, 2, 3 employees on rotation at most. I didn't go in, I don't know her. I don't know what she'd think of a guy walking in off the street to tell her about a customer who isn't her problem, based on a favor a friend did for me 2 years ago that she'd deny if anyone asked. I told myself she'd figure it out on her own if there was anything to figure out. I don't work at the plant anymore. I left in early 2021 for a warehouse job that pays better and doesn't run past 6. I drive past that corner sometimes when I'm picking my mom up from her physical therapy. The laundromat's still open. I haven't seen the gray sedan since that one afternoon at the deli, but I wasn't looking for it either. That's the whole thing. I don't have a big ending for it. I just wanted to write it down somewhere. I drove livestock for a small outfit out of Grand Island for about 6 years, mostly cattle, sometimes hogs, occasional overnight runs east on I-80 to sale barns in Iowa. The job is boring in a way people who haven't done it don't really understand. You sit in a cab that smells like diesel and manure for 10 hours and try not to think about how many miles you have left. This was August 2021. I was hauling 42 head of Angus steers from a feedlot near Ogallala out to a buyer in Council Bluffs. Left the lot around 11 at night because the buyer wanted them there by early morning, and the temperature was easier on the animals after dark. My rig was a red Peterbilt with a double-deck potbelly trailer, the kind with slats you can hear the animals breathing through if you stand next to it in a quiet parking lot. The first 3 hours were nothing. Cornfields on both sides, the occasional truck stop sign, a coyote crossing near Kearney that I clipped the shoulder to avoid. I had a thermos of coffee my wife had packed and a bag of sunflower seeds. Radio was on low, some AM station out of Lincoln talking about crop prices. You get used to the sound of a full trailer. It's constant. 42 big animals shifting their weight, hooves scraping the aluminum floor, the occasional bellow when one of them gets shoved by a neighbor. Under all that, you can hear them breathing if you really listen. It's a wet, low sound, like a room full of people asleep, but louder. I checked on them about an hour into the run, at a scale house outside Lexington. Standard stop. Walked the tires, made sure the load was riding right, cracked the side door for a second, got hit with the smell and the noise you'd expect. One of the steers on the top deck stuck his nose through the slats and licked my sleeve. That was around midnight. Everything was normal. Somewhere past Grand Island, around 2 in the morning, I noticed it was quiet, not quieter, quiet. I remember I was tapping the steering wheel to a song and the tap sounded loud, which didn't make sense until my brain caught up. I muted the radio, rolled the window down 2 inches to cut the road noise. The trailer behind me was silent. No hoofbeats, no shifting, nothing. I figured a lot of things at first. Maybe they'd all settled in and were dozing. Cattle do sleep, sort of. Standing up, and a smooth stretch of road can put them into a kind of trance. But 42 of them all at once? I'd never had that happen. There's always one somewhere adjusting, snorting, kicking at another one's leg. I let it ride for maybe another 5 miles. Kept listening. My hands were tighter on the wheel than they'd been a minute before, and I didn't remember doing that. I took the next exit. It was a service road near a town called Wood River. Nothing but a shuttered gas station and a field of harvested corn on the other side of the frontage road. I pulled the rig onto the shoulder, killed the engine, and just sat there with the window down. Bugs. That's what I heard. Crickets in the ditch, cicadas somewhere in a tree I couldn't see. A big rig went by on the interstate behind me and faded off. From the trailer, nothing, not one sound. I climbed down from the cab. My knees popped. I had a mag light in the door pocket and I brought it with me, more out of habit than any real thought. I walked along the driver's side of the trailer, running my hand along the slats the way I always did when I stopped, feeling for warmth, for movement. The metal was warm from bodies. That was normal. But there was no breath under my palm. No rise and fall. Just heat. I got to the side door about halfway back. It's a hinged access panel we use to check on the animals on long hauls. I unlatched it slow, because a spooked steer can kick hard enough to break your arm through that gap, and I pulled it open. Every one of them was facing the back of the trailer. That's the part I want to be clear about, because I've told this to maybe 3 people, and every time I say it, I feel like I'm not describing it right. When you open that door on a load of cattle, they look at you. They turn their heads, or at least the ones closest to the door do, and the rest keep milling around, and there's noise, and hot breath, and eyes catching the light of your flashlight. None of them turned. Every animal in that trailer, both decks, was standing with its body angled toward the rear wall. Not exactly the same posture. Some were crowded up harder against each other than others, but every single head was pointed the same direction. They weren't moving. Their ears weren't twitching. I put the mag light on them, and the beam caught eyes, and none of the eyes blinked. I stood there with my hand on that door for I don't know how long, probably 10 seconds, felt longer. I said something out loud, I don't remember what. Something like, hey, or come on. I've said that 100 times opening that door, and normally you get at least a shift, a snort, an ear flick. Nothing moved. I ran my flashlight past them, toward the back of the trailer. Followed the direction they were all looking. There was the back wall, aluminum, dented in a couple places from years of use, streaked with the usual mess. A grated vent up top. That was it. Nothing there. No gap, no shape, no light. I looked back at the animals. Then I looked at the wall again, then back at them. The one closest to me was a big steer, maybe 1,300 pounds, black, with a white patch on his shoulder. His nose was about 8 inches from my face. I could smell him. Grass and manure, and that dusty, sweet smell cattle have when they've been on hay. His eye was open, and it was pointed at the back of the trailer, and I was standing right next to him, and he did not know I was there. Or he knew, and it didn't matter. I moved the beam slow, one animal at a time, working my way down the length of the trailer. Every eye pointed the same way. I've never seen cattle do anything in perfect unison. Even in a chute, they fight each other. One steps forward, one steps back, one turns his head to look at a bird. This wasn't that. This was 42 bodies doing one thing. I want to say I did something brave. Climbed in, walked to the back, banged on the wall. I didn't. I closed the door. I latched it. I walked back to the cab at a normal pace because for some reason, walking fast felt worse than walking slow. And I got in, and I started the engine, and I pulled back onto I-80. I drove with the radio off, kept the window cracked. For the first few miles, I kept waiting to hear something behind me, and there was nothing. And after a while, I started to think maybe I'd imagined how quiet it had been. That maybe they'd been making noise the whole time, and I just hadn't registered it. That kind of thinking is what you do at 2 in the morning on an empty road when you don't want to deal with what you saw. I called dispatch on the radio around 3 just to have a voice in the cab. Some kid I didn't know was on nights. I made up something about a soft brake pedal, and he told me to check it at the next stop. I said sure, hung up, didn't check anything. Then, somewhere around the exit for Aurora, they started up again, all at once. Not one steer testing the silence, and then the others joining. All of them, at the same moment, like somebody flipped a switch. Hooves shifting, a bellow from the upper deck, another one answering from below. The whole trailer full of animals doing what animals do, breathing and moving and pushing each other around. I checked the odometer later. From the shoulder at Wood River to where I heard them start again was almost exactly 12 miles. I got to the buyer's lot in Council Bluffs a little before 6, sun coming up gray behind the stockyards. The vet on site was a woman named Rennie, who I'd known for a couple years. She ran intake checks for that yard. She and a couple hands offloaded the steers and did the walkthrough. Checked eyes, checked hooves, listened to a few of them with a stethoscope. Took her maybe 40 minutes. She came back to where I was leaning on the cab, drinking the last of my coffee, and said the whole load looked clean. No stress markers, no signs of anything off. Said they'd shipped well. I asked her, and I tried to make it sound like small talk, if she'd ever heard of cattle all going quiet at the same time. Like, completely quiet, every one of them, for miles. She was writing on a clipboard, and she stopped writing. Didn't look up right away. When she did, she looked at me, the way somebody looks at you when they're trying to figure out how much you actually saw. She said, "Yeah, it happens." I waited. She said, "It means they can smell somebody you can't see." I asked her what she meant. She shook her head, said, "Not something I want to get into before breakfast, hun," and kept walking. Signed the sheet, tore off my copy, handed it to me on the way past. I stood in the lot for a while after that. Then I got in the cab and drove home.